Hey guys, Frozenballz here. And I know it's been a while since I last covered a frame in depth, but there again, I didn't really have much to talk about. However, we got a rework for a frame which is very dear to me, and that's Saryn. So here we go. First of all, for the people that don't know, I made an in-depth video about Saryn like a year ago now, which covered all of her mechanics, her strengths, weaknesses, and bugs. So if you haven't seen that, pause the video right now and go watch it. Seriously, you'll understand the context of everything I talk about and the issues I raise in this video a lot better if you do. Link will be in description. Anyway, Saryn. It's been a busy couple of weeks, hasn't it? Changes here, fixes there, tweaks to numbers, mechanics, changes to builds, playstyles. I mean, just keeping track of this is a job in its own. To be fair though, they probably wanted to take their time to do it right, and I mean, can we really blame them? We wouldn't want Saryn to be bugged for another 2 years, would we? But anyway, let's look at what's changed. First off, with the rework, Saryn got a nice armor buff. This is a very nice and welcome change for any build, but more specifically, melee builds. Also, just as a throwback, the original Saryn started out in update 7 with 125 armor. Good changes. Next, let's look at the abilities. I'll start off with Moat. So, first major change, you can no longer cast Spores on Moat. This essentially kills the whole Spore stationary playstyle and also removes the reduced energy cost of Spores when cast on Moat. Moat also now scales similarly to Rhino's Iron Skin. It will absorb damage for 3 seconds, which is then converted into health. This change is really good and increases the scaling of Moat, which was one of its main issues. Moat will also give you a 5-second speed boost when cast. This duration is pretty low, but when modded properly, she can be a pretty solid speedrunner. Toxin Lash also got some really nice changes. Its duration got buffed from 30 to 45 seconds and it will now affect all weapon types, but its effect is doubled for melee. Secondly, they removed the 2 energy restore on Spore Pop because she's supposed to be less energy hungry. We have to cast much more due to Spore spread changes, but she's not as energy hungry. Oh, and there are some changes to Contagion Cloud, I guess. Not gonna waste your time, don't bother. Anyway, Miasma actually got reworked and buffed in a way I did not expect at all. Like, it's very, very good now. Its range got increased from 15 to 20 meters, huge for AoE builds. Its energy cost got reduced to 75 because, you know, energy hungry and all that stuff. The duration for the takes got increased from 3 to 5 and then 6 seconds. And probably the biggest change is that instead of corrosive damage, it now deals viral damage, so technically it does double the damage. Speaking of damage, its damage actually got reduced from 375 to 300 in hotfix 22.20.7. But that change came alongside the energy reduction, increase in duration, and the speed change, so they kinda reduced it to kinda change its purpose. Anyway, the spread change. If an enemy is affected by spores, Miasma will deal double damage as it always has, but if the enemy dies while under the effects of Miasma while spores are ticking, they will also spread spores now. Now, this isn't really tied to the abilities per se, it's tied to the procs, so let me rephrase this to make it crystal clear. While under the effects of a corrosive proc, Miasma will deal double damage, and if killed while under the effects of a viral proc, it will spread spores. This was already the case for Molt and Toxin Lash's Toxin proc spreading spores, so this all fits pretty well into her design overall. Lastly, Miasma's stun duration lasts a bit longer now, but you can't restun enemies while they're still under the effects of Miasma. This isn't actually true, and I'll tell you why. Enemies are essentially just blocks with textures and guns, and their attacks are scripts that activate immediately regardless of their current state. Miasma's stun is just a visual animation, so in instances where enemies are running scripts, the animation might be overwritten or delayed, or even cancelled, which is why more often than not you will be able to restun enemies. But enough about Miasma, let's talk about Spores. First off, Spores damage type got changed from viral to corrosive damage. This is a pretty big change and got quite a few people upset because of one damage type being superior to the other. To compensate for this, they increased the status chance of Spores from 10% to 50% to make it better as a debuff ability. Spores also, however, lost the ability to transfer 50% of the toxin proc that popped it, as well as the viral explosion it dealt when being popped. Spores can also now be recasted onto enemies, which was a big issue before, but it's a pretty pointless change considering Spores now have infinite duration. If you do recast it, it will be at half the energy cost, but you'll lose 20% of your accumulated damage. Spores damage will now scale up to a cap of 100k damage, and this number will decay over time. The decay timer instantly reduces your total damage by 20% and will continually drain 10% of your current total damage every half a second. If you're inside a nullifier or a scrambus aura, it will drain 30% every half a second instead. The DPS parts of Spores has actually been a topic of debate due to how Spores scale and spread now. When Saryn 3.0 dropped, Spores damage scaled based on each tick done by Spores and would spread when enemies died. You couldn't really recast it, but you could pop your Spores for more damage or spread it through Toxin Lash. However, the spreading was bugged and the range depended on how you would pop the Spore, as you can see with this table. Now, Pablo confirmed to me that when he fixed this, the damage of Spores would pretty much never drop and that it promoted even more AFK play, which was not his intention at all, and thus it got changed again. With Saryn 3.5, or is it 3.5.1? I don't know anymore. But with the current version, damage now scales based on the number of enemies affected by Spores, with an upper cap of 10 enemies counting towards your total count. This damage also got doubled from 1 to 2, but considering you stack much less damage, this doesn't really cut it. Another massive change is that enemies now also don't spread Spores on death anymore, except on the enemies upon which Spores are cast. And of course, Spores also spread if you proc them with your Toxin or Viral procs. Yeah, we'll come back to this change in a bit. Furthermore, we also got some changes to Venom Dose Augment, which is actually pretty useful for more powerful AoE nukes like Maim, Discharge, and even another Saryn's Miasma. Lastly, we got CPU optimizations for Spores, but call shenanigans on this. Infinite duration, so you don't recast as often, doesn't result in less script errors or calculations needed by CPU, which hogs systems over time as more Spores are casted. FX being changed and enemies having a hard cap of 3 Spores is proof of my theory that didn't actually fix or optimize anything, and honestly, covering something up is not the same as fixing. Anyway, I'll keep my opinions for the end of the video, but with all of the changes of the abilities and the Loch-Ness monster that is Spores behind us, let's look at some builds. The first build is based around Miasma. Viral damage plus procs plus range buffs plus more ticks plus less energy makes for a very strong AoE nuke. Miasma is back, and while you won't be hitting for 25k like you could back in the day, it's still pretty strong for low to mid level missions like Hydron or for blitzing exterminate missions. In this particular build, Streamline and a rank 3 fleeting expertise put us at 70% efficiency, so 22.5 energy cost per cast, which allows us to cast 13 times instead of 6 if we were to use Prime Flow and Streamline. All range mods allow us to sit at a 56 meter radius on Miasma for killing as many enemies as possible. It also puts Spore spread to 44 meters, which is perfect for even more DPS. Prime Continuity helps counteract the duration loss from Fleeting, and Transient Fortitude combined with Umbral Intensify gives us a lot of power strength. Arcane wise, Energize and Guardian are pretty solid for energy regen and survivability. I use this combined with Mage's Elevate, and I usually run Naramon or Zenuric as my focus schools. The second build is based around Mold. With the changes, Mold turns Saryn into a very respectable speedrunner, and while she doesn't have the protection some other speedrunners have, it's a fun build to mess around with. Blind Rage and Intensify put us at 2.22 speed multiplier, while Fleeting Expertise, Streamline, and Prime Flow help counteract the efficiency loss and put us at a pretty good 33 energy cost. Narrow-minded, Prime Continuity, and Constitution help increase our duration to 10.9 seconds on our speed buff, which is more than enough for most cases. Rush and Sprint boost increase our base speed, which is multiplied by more. Honestly, arcanes are up to your choice. I personally prefer running Energize for energy regen and Fury for more melee DPS. Mage's Elevate for those quick HP heals, and Zenuric or Naramon depending on if I'm running a lot of melee or not. Now, before I cover the final build, I want to touch on Spores and Synergy a bit first, because I feel like a lot of people are putting too much emphasis on this ability when playing Saryn. If you just compare every first ability in the game, then Spores is by far the most overly complex ability there is. Just look at the wiki page, how long that is. It actually does quite a lot for a first ability as well. It strips armor, does AoE damage better than a lot of first abilities do as well, you know. And yet, people are seriously complaining about the damage being changed from viral to corrosive. Like really? That's your issue? The mediocre take damage being a different color? Because that's literally it. What I'm most surprised about is that nobody's complaining about the 2 energy restore when popping Spores being removed, or the viral explosions from popping Spores is gone. And I'm not even going to go in depth and the potential the 50% damage from Toxin procs had if it was fixed instead of being removed. These mechanics had real synergy and promoted knowledge and unique active playstyles. Instead, people complain about their take damage, something that more or less got replaced with Miasma. But anyway, the main point I want to address is how Spores are spread now and how they synergize with other abilities and how our playstyle has changed. As you know, Spores now only spread if popped by viral or toxin procs, or if the enemy upon which these spores have been casted dies. This spread change came because, according to Pablo, after he fixed the inconsistencies with the range of spores, it was almost impossible for the damage to drop, and it promoted AFK play, which wasn't his intention with the rework at all. The change, however, made it pretty much impossible to keep up your damage because you are literally dependent on spawns. The moment a group of infected enemies dies, you better have a spawn close by or your damage will start to decay, and that right there is my issue with the design of Spores. We get this new rework and Spores have scaling damage and armor removal, but the damage is first of all capped at 100k because DE saw how people played Onslaught, and secondly, you are spawn dependent, so you will almost always lose your accumulated damage at some point in time because Spores were initially designed to spread on death, and that part got gutted because people were killing in Onslaught too efficiently. So what is the point of this scaling mechanic then? By the time you reach high numbers, you kill your group of enemies too fast and you lose your damage, and on low level missions you kill them anyway, so you never really get to stack damage. It's literally capped twice in scaling due to design. The other use for Spores is the debuff, but to get it to remove armor reliably, you need 100% plus status chance, so you pretty much have to mod for power strength and thus damage. But by design, they don't want us to focus on damage anymore? Like, I don't get the idea behind this. Either have us focus on debuff with the scaling damage as a bonus, or have us focus on damage but not somewhere in between. With the spread changes, I honestly didn't know what they were going for with Spores, and I still somewhat don't. But one thing was for sure, and that's they didn't want us to nuke entire maps anymore. So from that point on, I treated Spores as debuffing tools rather than DPS. You couldn't spread it on death, and the only way to spread it was via Toxic Lash, so it's more of a local nearby AoE ability, and I already have plenty of damage for clearing rooms, so damage wasn't really its selling point. Honestly, the moment I came to terms with this, Spores became a lot better. You weren't meant to spread it all to enemies across the map. It's an armor removal ability and it should be used as such. Think of it as Ashes seeking Shuriken but AoE. The changes in update 22.20.7 more or less solidified my stance on Spores as debuffer and buffed the way I already played with Spores. If you casted Spores on enemies, if that enemy died, it would spread those Spores, and if enemies died while on the effects of miasma or rather Viroprox, Spores would spread as well. Now, Pablo actually tried to go for some synergy here by having people spread Spores with Toxic Lash and then spread them even further with miasma. However, that last bit didn't really work out as well as you probably intended to, because the spread range of Spores remains the same no matter what procs them to spread, and because Toxic Lash boosts your damage and lasts 9 times as long as miasma at base, there isn't really a reason to use miasma to spread Spores. If you wanted us to use miasma as a sort of burst spread, then the spread range would have to be at least double when killing enemies with miasma. That way, you would have this repeating cycle of popping Spores with your Toxic Lash and spreading them further with miasma to prepare the next batch of enemies ready to be butchered. Anyway, Spores, debuff, different playstyle. You're meant to be more active with them, and that scaling damage is a bonus, not its main feature. The armor removal is what they want us to focus on. However, currently Spores apply a corrosive proc, and in terms of armor removal, corrosive procs are simply not good enough. They remove 25% of the target's current armor value, which in higher missions makes this essentially useless because of how armor scales. Instead, they should have it remove 10% of the total armor every second and have it scale with power strength. That way it becomes a meaningful debuff ability and people won't focus so much on its damage aspect. But anyway, the corrosive proc is actually useful for one thing, it's proc. We already want to have our Toxin Lash active at all times for the extra damage, and thus we get free Toxin procs. With Spores, we get free corrosive procs as well, and viral damage is just extra safety for spreading Spores, plus debuffing enemies for more DPS. That's 3 constant procs. For the people that have seen my previous video, you know exactly where I'm going with this. Condition overload. That's right, the melee queen is back with a vengeance this time. Let me show you why people focus too much on Spores. These enemies have a combined EHP of 247,543,462.80. And it's gone. Now what happened? Well, as you all know, Condition Overload buffs your damage by the formula shown on screen. But we also have another instance of damage that's being buffed. That would be Toxin Lash. With the rework, the buff from Toxin Lash for melee is double, so with 70% extra power strength, you're going to get 100% extra toxin damage based on your total melee damage. This toxin damage is however also added on top of your melee damage before Condition Overload is calculated. This turns Saryn into a beast of a melee frame, so let's talk about the build. Blind Rage, Intensify, and Power Drift boost our Toxic Lash multiplier to 146.4. Prime Continuity helps keep our Toxic Lash last longer, because I'm lazy and I don't like to cast often. Streamline and Prime Flow give us manageable efficiency and a large energy pool to fall back on, and Energize helps with regen and sustain. Quick Thinking combined with a large energy and health pool, as well as Arcane Guardian plus that new buffed armor stat, give us a total EHP of 12,160. Stretch is more than plenty for the spread range, as we won't be focusing on the damage aspect of Spores anyway, we just want the proc. This time we go with Steel Charge because it multiplies our total melee damage, and even with armor we have Spores to remove it, so we can focus completely on the damage aspect. There's also a DPS melee variant as well, which you can see right here. In terms of focus schools, Naramon, until the melee changes come through, any build sucks without Naramon. Melee-wise, you can use any hybrid weapon that has good crit, good status, and lots of fast hits. In my case, I'm using the Sigma Noctantis, but you can use stuff like the Nikana Prime, Ninkondi, Deokiris, you name it. This is the current build that I'm using right now for the Sigma Noctantis. This thing absolutely shreds. You don't even need an Ignis for extra, as you're already slicing through 247 million EHP without any issues. But for those that like overkill, let's count procs. Spores gives corrosive, Toxic Lash gives toxin, our melee gives viral and potentially slash, puncture, or impact procs based on what weapon and stance you're using. The Artex, our little buddy, gives free cold procs, and my Ignis is modded for blast electric for maximum CC, so that's 3 more procs. That's 7 guaranteed procs and up to 10 possible procs when playing solo. Now that's ranging from a 26.8 multiplier to a fucking 109 times damage multiplier. So a 10k hit would give 14,640 extra toxin damage, and that total of 24,640 damage would then be multiplied by 26.8 to a whopping 660,352 damage. And we didn't even take into account Steel Charge multiplying our total melee damage, or Blood Rush, or combo counters yet. Toxic Lash combined with Condition Overload is simply insane. All the changes to Saryn have pretty much solidified her position as a melee frame more than anything. But that's pretty much it in terms of builds. So, what do I think about the rework? She's actually in a very good spot now. She's got a lot more variety in builds, isn't nearly as complex, and isn't as buggy as she used to be. However, I do wonder as to why a lot of the more unique mechanics in her kit was simply removed. They brought a lot of depth to the frame, which I enjoy and find missing in a lot of frames these days. About the rework specifically, Miasma and Toxin Lash are both in a great place. I think they function the way they're designed to, as well as allowing people who know a lot about mechanics to abuse the shit out of it without breaking the game. Miasma more or less replaced Spores as AoE DPS for low-level missions, and Toxic Lash just buffs our damage and turns her into a melee beast, so good changes overall. Mold also got much better, but it still needs some attention. Scaling health is great and was one of my suggestions more than a year ago, but the second part of Mold's problem was the aggro range, which unfortunately is still not moddable. If we could mod for range to draw enemies fire, she could also provide a unique way of CC, and pretty much every Saryn already mods for range, so it'd be a nice buff. Another idea would be to use the remaining health of Mold as an offensive tool, but given the Saryn already has such an array of DPS abilities, I would rather see her attention more towards the utility side of things for this ability. The speed buff, although short, is very nice and provides a niche build, but I'd like to see her augment integrated so that her augment can also be used for something more interesting and unique. As for Spores, you can clearly tell it was designed as a different ability, but there have been changes towards promoting the debuff aspect, and as long as they continue in that direction, I feel it will turn out great eventually. Personally, I would either increase the status chance to 100% if you're keen on keeping corrosive procs, or give it 10% armor removal of total armor every second. That way, its design is at least in line with the intent behind it. As for synergy, I feel like Pablo tried to introduce a lot of synergy with abilities for a more active playstyle, and the changes in update 22.20.7 actually nearly achieved this. I think his intent was to have players use both Toxic Lash and Miasma to spread spores for a more varied playstyle. The issue with this, however, is that Toxic Lash is far more energy efficient in terms of spreading spores. It lasts literally 9 times as long as base as Miasma does, so in order for people to use Miasma as spore spreading tool, it should buff the spread range when enemies are killed by Miasma. That way, there's some real synergy between abilities, and people will be most likely to use more than just 1 or 2 abilities. Lastly, I feel that a lot of the player base is still stuck in their old ways and they want to rely on AoE DPS a bit too much at the moment, but over time I think that will change as they experiment more with melee. And that's it for Saryn itself. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank a couple of people. First off, huge shout out to Pablo for contacting me and working silently on Saryn and listening to feedback. This is how design is perfected. More hands make hard work lighter, and feedback and development when working together make for a great game. I know I can sometimes come across as harsh, but that's only myself as well as other players are heavily invested emotionally and by time into the game and the frames that we play with, and we want the best for it. Secondly, massive thanks to Arthi for helping me gather a lot of this information about the mechanics and a lot of the explanations. A lot of what you see in my videos is also thanks to his help. He does a lot of work behind the scenes, especially when it comes to maintaining the Imgur album and helping with the number crunching, so seriously, mad props to the dude. I have a couple of other announcements to make. I will be traveling to Canada on the 4th for TennoCon, and I will be in the country for the full month of July. D is flying me out for TennoCon, and I will be on a YouTuber/Twitch panel at TennoCon with Daniel the Demon, SkillUp, and Mogamo. And I will also be streaming from the convention as well, so keep an eye out. What this means for Twitch is that there won't be a regular stream schedule since I won't have access to my PC. I did buy a laptop, so I will be aiming to create videos and content while I'm in Canada. I have a plan for a new Warframe series called How Would You Change X, focusing on how to improve frames in the current iteration of the game to make them better and more usable, kind of like how Nidus and Saryn's kit are. This series is aimed at more of a user interaction and discussions with you guys too, taking feedback in comments, etc. I will try and also make a vlog while I'm in Canada, documenting TennoCon and other stuff while I'm here. I am also now a Dauntless partner, so if you're a Twitch sub and you fancy my Dauntless partner flair, hit me or one of my moderators up in the sub channel and they'll get you a key for the flair. Once I'm back in August, I'll be making some stream specific changes which I will announce closer to the date. If you have any questions, comments, or any such thing, leave it in the comment section below and come be a part of the discussions on Discord, etc. I hang out there almost all the time when I'm not live, so it's the best way to connect. That's it for this video. I do hope you guys like it, and if you did, leave a thumbs up or not if you didn't. And I'll see you in the next one.